So, welcome, Andreas. We will be giving the second talk in our afternoon session where we focus on database methods and on database learning and modeling. And we saw your paper, and it was interesting. The paper you suggested, it was not a paper of yourself, but of someone else, giving a very nice and accessible explanation of why different kinds of models that you determine or build for one case you shouldn't use for other cases, really. They're probably somewhat connected to what you're talking about now.
I hope so. I will also say why I picked this paper.
Yeah. So then, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I thought we're really high up, so we should have kind of a bird view on things, and now that's also why the presentation is really high level. So when I realized I hadn't put a real equation into it, probably let's see how this audience will respond to that. So it's a bit two parts. One thing what I want to hint with the title is that when we do modeling and model selection, we use probabilities and plots a lot of other formal things, but there's much more to it, and a lot of it is kind of informal. And this informal part is something really important. And the second part is one thing which can move some stuff that we usually do informally to a more formal ground is causal inference. So I split the talk a bit in two parts. The first one is a very rough high-level idea of what causal inference can do. And I mean causal inference in the sense of Perl, so that's not my invention. So I would say all the glory goes to him and his co-authors, and all the confusing presentation is due to mine. But I also have to say, most of this stuff was since 20 years invented, and it solves some real problem that people have out in the field, and still it hardly penetrates. And I think this is also a lack of presenting the approach in a way that really tells people, look, if you have this problem, this goes in, this goes out. So I think this is a really important translation step if you ever want to take that your method takes it. And the paper I suggested was one of the first one that does this in ecology. And I think in that sense, it's really important because the confusion is endless in this kind of modeling. And I just have an example of this kind of modeling. That's these distribution models. The people are not aware of it. That's something that ecologists like to do. Imagine you have a lot of sites somewhere in the countryside, and you go there and you count how many species do you find? Do I find a certain species? Yes or no? Often there's a count how much, but these are just two flavors. And at the same time of every species, you count some of every site, you measure some properties. This is an example where the deep is for fish in different little rivers. So you check, do I find a trout there? Yes or no? And how deep is the river? What's the temperature and other properties? And at the end, what you do in species distribution model, it's really classic machine learning. Given this data, I would like to have a model that predicts me if a species is present or not. And I think it can't be more classic machine learning, and that's also how the field kind of approaches it. They like to have discussion, should we use random forest or support vector machine or a neural network, and then start benchmarking or maybe even a sample model. And that's all good because you basically can just follow prediction. And prediction is one of these tasks which is nice because it's very well defined. That's the reason why we have cable competitions. The rules are really set out. So once we agree on the performance metric, we know how to assess it. We can do data splitting, cross-validation. If you have enough data and patience and computational power, we always can figure out which model is better in principle. Same is even true a little bit to generalization. If I want to, for example, if I want to predict for sites at different rivers, it might be that the model overfits at certain rivers. And if I now make a prediction for an unseen river, it does a poor job in generalization, but even that we could measure. If I just have more data of more rivers and more data would solve this, I can measure performance. I just have to be careful with my cross-validation. So that's all nice, and I think that really follows the kind of the standard procedure, Google machine learning tutorial kind of stuff. And it's also somewhat successful. The problem is kind of this, that people would like that their model are useful. And this is a quote that took one of a paper I was also involved. People say, we do this modeling not just because it's cool, because somebody can use this and make better decisions. They can manage the streams better. They can derive something useful out of it. And based on all kind of prior knowledge, there's also a lot of tribal knowledge around that somehow people have the feeling we shouldn't just use all the data, we have to select a bit careful. And that's, for example, one, they say the lyric mechanistic effects are important, whatever exactly that kind of means. And this is very important for interpretation, for management. So there are different kind of this tribal knowledge, and if you go in psychology, where they have these structural equation models, it's kind of the same, it's probably even bigger. So there's a really, people know at the same time, just following this kind of optimizing predictive performance is maybe what we're doing, and that's what we are good at. At the same time, we feel a bit bad about it because somehow this thing around, we probably should not include all variables, or maybe the variables we should really include. So this variable selection problem is always a bit back in the head, but it's treated in a really informal way. And if you think this management use is kind of a common thing if you want conservation. If you really think what is management about, I came up with this kind of definition. I think this is probably not universal, but I think management at the core is basically deciding what we want to do. So deciding if you should pay the farmers to use less pesticides, if you should kind of remove barriers for the fish, stuff like this. And our model we trained kind of answers these predictive questions. What do I know about a certain outcome if I have some information or know some other stuff? So if you do a Bayesian, you can say this is your belief, or otherwise it's your frequencies or something like this. But the management question is very similar, but they want to know what happens to Y if I do something. And this now, we can still use, I have an equation. We can use just the, well, let's say the predictive questions. I just use normal condition probabilities, and then this is what Pearl uses. That okay, if you want to emphasize that this X is not just something we observe, but we actually enforce it. We set our variable X to a certain value, then we use this tool to really kind of distinguish these two things. Now, if I present this, in many cases, people think, oh, this is just really a subtlety and it doesn't really matter. And that's true in many cases. And therefore, I just bring one super silly example where it's not the case, just to get really this point across. So imagine I would like to measure rain, something we all try to do and it's hard. We could put up a camera in principle, observing a street, and I have some classifier and counting the fraction of people that are carrying umbrellas. It would be a good signal. I can measure rain at the same time, and I would expect there's some correlation. So there's no real data, of course. So I could now use all my predictive modeling skills, machine learning, with some model, do some uncertainty analysis, cross-validation, whatever. And I'm really sure I can now say, okay, if I see so many umbrellas, I guess the rain intensity is in this range. Of course, this is just based on the observational data. And if I would do an intervention experiment, something I often cannot do in natural system, but here, let's assume we do it. I send people on the street with different umbrellas, measure the rain intensity, and surprise, surprise, correlation is gone. So this is probably one of the simplest, silly examples where obviously these two things are not the same. Of course, we can also come up with a lot of examples where these are the same, with the axis, for example. And that's basically the core at causal inference in the sense of Pearl, basically deciding, are there observational distributions? Are they the same as the interventional distributions that we have? Because if it's the case, then I train my model on my data, and I know I have basically a logical guarantee that I can make a valid statement to that. In this case, causal inference will tell you we cannot do that. So we have our data-derived model or mechanistic model, whatever. We have our model based on observational data. And basically, this part is usually done as interpretation. So if you read about some psychological paper or something like this, where it's really unclear how this stuff works, you have a really long discussion where people try to express, is this now the same or not, under what conditions, and so on. What causal inference is doing is basically helping us with this interpretation. And for the ingredient it needs is what they call the causal graphical model. This is, in the simplest, it's a directed acyclic graph, which basically designs how we see the worldview. For example, giving an example before, I would state, I believe if I'm making an intervention with the rain, we change the umbrella and not the other way around. So that's not fun if I just have two numbers, but in principle, I can make a whole graph, and this is, don't take it serious, this was an early draft we discussed once about fish. You could say, what happens if I change the elevation? I mean, it's quite hypothetical. If I shift my streak up 500 meters, probably the temperature is changing, but if I change the temperature, the elevation is not changing. So it's not always crystal clear how to link this, but you always have to think this kind of causality as an interventional causality. And that's, I think, it's quite different from the kind of causality we heard in the morning, which to my understanding is more a bit about predictive capabilities. That's maybe something we can later discuss in detail. So something which works really well with experts, and especially experts that are not too deep into models, come up with graphs like this. And they can be really large, and they usually involve way more nodes or variables than we can observe. So what we now do in causal inference, we say, okay, what I really care about my outcome, the fish, and I decide what's my potential intervention I would like to do. General risk variability. And then we can take our whole graph, our symbolic network, apply do calculus, backdoor criteria, and so on. And what we get out is a minimal sufficient adjustment set. I think that's one of the big contributions to the Perl. And this minimal sufficient adjustment set basically tells you which variables do you have to include into your model. It doesn't have to be a minimal set, it can also be a larger set, but it also tells you if you include variables that you should not include in your model, because there's a logical fallacy sometimes. I know I don't want to make a spontaneous example, but we can easily construct examples where we should not include all variables if you want to measure some effective interventions. So, and the important part of this is so far there were no data involved. It's really basically take prior knowledge, formalize it as a graph, and then apply this machinery that basically just operates symbolically on this graph and derives you some statement. So this expands kind of our workflow. So we have this variable selection, what happens to y if I change x. In the best case, if let's say y is what I'm interested in the best case, this analysis that you look, you'll say if it's the same thing, just take your x and y, train a model, you'll find. That's usually the bit boring case. In many cases, this is not true, but it can tell you, look, you can never make this statement, but you can say, but you figured out it's something true if I add some variable, and that's this sufficient, minimal sufficient adjustment sets. And important is the sets plural, which is very convenient because if you draw your node and you include variables like maybe some genetic factors or something, which you can never measure in reality, but you know it might play a role. There may be some sets that include variables that you cannot measure, while you have others which are really easy or cheaper to measure. So you can kind of, it gives a different option to pick. You can also be unlucky and you can never make the statement based on the data you have that you would like to do. That means you probably have to collect very different data. And I think one of the tools which is really great and kind of, I would say, allows me to popularize it if I do consulting is this webpage that is connect. They have a bit of teaching resources, but they're really important. They have a great R package that does all the symbolic analysis. But I think really this web interface is really great. And once people get the key idea, they can draw this thing, they get these different kind of outputs of sets. You can get other things, for example, if this is true, which kind of conditional independence has to be fulfilled, and so on. So you get a lot of information, basically pretty much everything you can get without having actual data. So it can be used either as an experimental design tool, deciding what should I really measure, but I think it's also useful just if you get a bunch of data and you want to be sure, can I really make this statement I would like to do? So, and what is also nice that this workflow, because it's not based on data, it's very complementary with, let's say, the traditional machine learning or modeling workflow. So, for example, what we could do at the beginning, we want to decide what's our outcome, basically target variable, and the intervention, basically the one we would like to modify. That's a bit the terminology they use. Then we make our causal cyclical dog. And my experience that for many cases, it's easy. There are some cases where this, let's say, this view on the reality doesn't really work, but if you have a right one, people tend to find this very natural. And what this is called, but sometimes the strong assumptions, strong in sense, we say there is some dependency. I don't know how it looks like, but the really strong assumption is I think this dependency does not exist. And once I do this, I get my minimal sufficient adjustment sets. I pick some based on practical constraints on data availability, something like this. And then basically I can do the whole normal modeling workflow. And this is something called the weak assumption. The weak assumption might be, I know this relationship has to be monotonously increasing or something like this. Or I believe this is a certain shape based on other information. But there again, we can do even try different adjustment sets, can do cross-validation and so on. We're basically back on our normal machine learning feed. One nice thing which was once pointed out by a researcher from Roche, that their researcher cannot usually agree how humans work because that's really complicated. Some people say there's a pathway between these genes and whatever. So what they do, they make these really large graphs. And when people disagree, they check if this disagreement really changed the minimal adjustment sets, because in many cases, there might be a disagreement, but it's not relevant for the actual questions they have in hand. And if you imagine if your graph is big enough, that's really hard to reason about in a manual sense. And I think for that, it's really a great tool. So just short repetition for the first part. So I think it's model independent, so there's no normality assumed, no linearity, and so on. If you're familiar with a structural equation model, it's very similar, but they make these additional strong assumptions, so it's kind of all the theory. No observations, no data involved. And I think that's a really important one because the name is kind of tricky. Causal inference kind of implies, oh, I give data and it tells me now what is the cause. And it's really not about causal discovery, this approach. It's really assuming we have from some other information, we state what we believe the world functions like, and then we derive some logical conclusion we can do. So I find this is really fascinating, but I sometimes have trouble to convene the idea why I think this is really kind of a fundamental improvement and not just kind of a improvement of an existing method. And that's what I try to argue a bit in the second part. So if you think about model selection, there we have a lot of different criteria we care of, and this is kind of an incomplete list. We have predictions, something we would like to have good predictions. Prediction of interventions, that's what we said, okay, we have causal inference, we just talked about it. That's very often a good reason to favor one model of the other. But then we have other things. For example, sometimes or quite often actually in engineering, we would like to not make prediction about states that we don't observe. Here, a super simple example, that's a urban drainage network. We probably have measurement of the water levels at the outlet. The engineers don't really care what happens here. They would like to know which manhole here is flooding first if you get a big storm. So basically, we cannot just use a machine learning model that links rain to this single measurement, but we add some extra information saying, okay, this is a meaningful model. And I think you had this modeler, what was the term? Hierarchical modularity. I think that goes in the same direction. Which I found quite a nice term. I was not finding good word, but
compositionality was also
yeah, that's also a good one. Sometimes you want insights, right? Especially scientists. And I had this quote, unfortunately, I can't find it anymore, but somebody wrote it on the internet, so it must be good. Yeah, machine learning learns, works, but we are still as stupid as before, and that's a bit frustrating, right? And so therefore, we very often are not happy with this, so we prefer a model that kind of gives us some insights. And then we have all kind of crazy mathematical machineries, from super simple things like a phase plot to whatever. This is great, explain the machine learning, but I think still we have to decide if we're now enlightened or not. So it's a very personal decision, even if this tool might help us. And I also had often, when I do consulting, this kind of paradox. People explain me, yeah, you know, my system is so complex, interaction, everything non-linear. And if you then start making the model a bit complex, you say, no, now it's really hard to interpret. I would like to keep it simple. So this is some kind of a balance, which I don't know how to really deal with it. But it probably links to this desire for aesthetic and simplicity. There's some two famous quotes where people kind of really think, you know, our models have to be beautiful, fields have to be beautiful, and probably very often it's not a bad filter. So we're back?
Yeah.
But of course, there's also a lot of criticism just because it's something is, maybe the reality is just complicated. Then there's no, and if you then look for something super simple, you'll never find it. So, but it seems there's a clear desire. And what I want to do with this different kind of desires is to kind of lay them out on this kind of figure. So I think On the horizontal axis, I would like to ask a question, okay, where is the information from? And now information is much bigger than engendering for me. This can be anything. Some information is really, let's say, the objective stuff. These are our measurements, artifacts on the left side. And then we have this intuition, human judgment, experience, and so on. That would be on the right side. And on the vertical axis, I would like to distinguish how do we use actually this information. Some of the information we formalized very nicely, mathematically rigorous, and we can also do something very informal. If we now place these things, what we had before, I would say calibration, because that is a well-defined problem. It's pretty much in the top left corner once we agreed, which is probably coming from here, how we measure success. Bayesian inference is kind of nice. It's very formalized, but takes much more intuitive prior knowledge into account. Then we could also use data in a very informal way, plotting, super helpful, or manual calibration, hopefully a bit out of fashion, but still a thing sometimes. So we can do useful things in a very informal way with hard facts. And of course, this corner is probably the most popular one. I would say there's some metrics where people try to formalize or measure how aesthetically pleasing something is, but I'm not sure how convincing that is. I think typically that's something very personal, very informally evaluated. If I get an insight of a model, I would also say it's a pretty informal thing. We cannot measure how insightful something is, or I don't know how yet. Also kind of the belief, if we think this is a model, and this is probably not so clear. If this model is good enough, if we think this is a physical theory-based model, we should trust it or not. I think there is no mathematical formalized theory to tell you, now this is a good physical model, we can trust it, or this is a machine learning model, you cannot extrapolate something. So that's also really based on the informal human judgment. And of course, the whole causal inference, can we use our model now for predicting intervention is in the huge majority until now is really done this informal thing. That's usually the long discussion section at the end of the paper. And what I think is really astonishing, for me at least, that we can really shift this border. We can now take something that we did for years, kind of in a very informal way, and we always struggled with it. And it really kind of provides us a tool to make this automatically in a very formalized way. I think this is usually always a big win. And why is it a big win? Because everything on top of here, first of all, we have to make it explicit. So it's much easier to communicate and see where we disagree compared to we just have some long sentences kind of hidden. Basically, that's why algebra was such a progress over comparing math and verbs. But also we can use computers now to make this automatic. Well, I would say this is the flowery part, that's still kind of stuff we can do as humans, so that should be fun. But then when I had this figure, then I thought, okay, we have this really big elephant in the room. So a year ago, I would have stopped here, and I think this is a large language model, ChatGPT and friends. And it's, I don't know if they really look like this, as one other AI told me. But I think what they are amazing, they're really not that great in math and so on, but what they're really good is basically doing what was on the lower part. I didn't do any experiments very carefully, but this was just a quick try last week. Can you do me a causal graph? It's including all my typos, and it's this really classic example, sun, ice cream, sun and drowning. And to tell it, yeah, do first a bit of thinking about and then draw the graph, it does something fairly reasonable. One could argue there might be other errors and so on, but I think in principle, given that this machinery read more papers than we all of them, and if they probably in 5 or 10 years get even better and saying less nonsense, I could very well imagine that we can say, hey, scan the literature and think what is the majority evidence we have for a certain causal relationship, for example. So to wrap this a bit up, so if you take the first part, just causal inference as a tool, I think it really helps us with this interpretation. We have this observational data. We cannot or we don't want to do interventions, like we do not want to pollute the river just to see if this really affects the fish, for example. And it basically tries to answer, is our interpretation of a data-driven model the same as we would get with interventions? Yes or no? And if no, is there another way around by adding more variables? And with the repetition, and I think the most important thing is it kind of helps us to avoid some logical fallacies. Because for simple cases, if you have 3 or 4 nodes, we can always reason this stuff out in our head. There's also a lot of kind of guidelines in this. But soon things get a bit too complicated. Like everything we use computers for, we understand the simple examples, but we can use now the machinery to scale these things up and we still trust it. And again, it's not about figuring out what is the causality based on data. I'm not sure if this, I think there's some theories that try to do this, but I haven't found anything that actually worked. If you have dynamic systems, this is much harder. And that's maybe something we can discuss. Now we have a lot of causal inference experts here in the room. Maybe if there's some merge possible with the approach we had in the morning, or if we have closed feedback loops, then we kind of trapped, right? What comes first? It's also not helping when you say, oh, I just have a small data set. I use this extra information. It doesn't really help. It will not tell you if my extrapolation, if let's say the causal inference tells me, yes, I can fit the model and I can predict my intervention. But if my intervention, of course, is too big and the model has never seen this in the data, it's still wrong. So basically, all the responsibilities we have as a model for extrapolation and so on, it doesn't take it away from us. And for this kind of second bit bigger part, we have these different goals, and I'm sure we have more of them. And I think important is we have formalized parts that we kind of have an automatic reasoning about it, and especially we have a really explicit communication. Oh, here it's still and here it's black. Okay. Yeah, we have an informal part, which I think probably in everyday life, this part might be even much, much bigger than this one. There was last year a paper where they, in economy, where they send out the same data set, I think, to 100 research teams about the question about unemployment and tax benefits or something like this. And they really got all results. 50% basically said it's helping, and 50% it's saying it's not helping, and the middle said it's kind of, so same data set, and they were all pretty carefully reasoning why they think the model is the right one. So we have a really, I think, a huge uncertainty coming from our informal reasoning, our human training, whatever. And then I would really think, I'm really curious how we deal with this in not this year, but maybe next year and 5 years, that we have now a machinery that's not awfully good on this part, but somehow excellent on this part. You can try it, give it 2 equations and ask which one is more elegant. And it probably gives you an answer you're going to agree on. So I think it just studied so much human behavior, so it's really good at mimicking our preferences. So I was wondering if this is a good thing or a bad thing. And I think it's something we should kind of consider how we're going to include this in the modeling workflow in the bigger scale. Yeah, that's about it. I think we're going to share the presentation at some point. There's some references. And these are just some kind of open questions I had by preparing the talk. Especially this one, I was kind of curious what you guys think. Oh, it's really small. Should I read it out? Okay. I have a strong feeling that if you do mechanistic modeling or physical-based modeling, that kind of causal by construction, but I was not quite sure if this is really the case. Then that's what I just had before. How much of our job can we, in principle, delegate to a large language model? I didn't want to use the word AI, although it might be the better word. I have a strong feeling that our preference for simplistic models, maybe even Occam's razor, has probably more to do with our, let's say, cognitive limitations, that we not can handle 1,000 nodes at one, but we would like to have 3 things. And then I was especially kind of in the large things model. Is it a good idea that we think we should prioritize the insight of the scientists over, let's say, learning from a model? And for us, it might be clear we want to learn, but if you think as a society, they don't have a big benefit if you give them consulting and say, yeah, I really understood it. Or if you give them a model, that's probably even better, but the model can say, yeah, I'm really good at it. So maybe that's also more our personal justification because it feels really good to understand. Yeah, that's about just some points for discussion.
Yes, very productive. So, anyways, I don't know where to begin. I have
so many issues with the presentation.
Yeah, well, let's go through them.
When you are doing this directed acyclic graph,
Mhm.
you're assuming it does not change in time. And okay, let's backtrack.
Mhm.
You say you do that without data. How do you do that?
I would say if you think data without observational data that you model, but if you take data about literature and so on, for example, maybe make this fish example, although it's not really good.
So you're using essentially past knowledge. Is that what you're saying?
It's basically knowledge from the scientists. It's
Okay.
very simple.
How do we know they are right if you don't validate it with the data that is out there? Point number one.
Okay, well, then let's start point 1.1.
Yeah.
So first of all, we don't know. But the good thing is, if I state my graph and I think that's how the world is functioning, and you disagree, you have your graph, and we know exactly where we disagree, and then we can dig in if this arrow is wrong or right. That's one thing, and the other thing is, if we have some data, we can tease out some testable assumptions. For example, we have conditional independence; they must be fulfilled if this graph is right or not. And if we test for one of them, we find the dependency, then we clearly know the graph is wrong. But I think we can never prove that the whole graph is correct.
Well, the problem I have is temporal invariance of that graph.
Super hard, yes.
Basically, it means that no matter what you do, the graph structure is not going to change. And that is fundamentally wrong. I cannot see a system where that would not change. Number one, let's take the second argument that we are uncomfortable with very complex models. When you use Google Maps, it's a very complex model behind. It simplifies to what we need.
Mhm.
It intervenes. There is a traffic jam. It will tell you to go on some other route, thereby easing up that traffic jam. So half an hour later, the traffic is clear. So the interventional model, the intervention basically changes the directed acyclic graph structure. And in nature, that happens because if you pollute the river, the whole trophic structure is going to change. And in the process, the quality of water is going to change. The population dynamics is going to change. The entire dependence is going to change. And to say that this is temporally invariant and all I do is use that do calculus to infer whatever is not going to sit well with any inference. Not any colleges, I cannot use your language.
Yeah.
I think that is fundamentally out of place with any dynamical system approach.
I probably agree. It's not very suited for dynamic systems, but you also have to see this kind of modeling I presented. It's on a way, way coarser level than probably what you use. So people really just say, I mean, even the sampling of the data. I pick up some fish, see, oh yeah, it's a trout, drop it back in. And then I see, oh, there's a lot of agriculture around and it's pretty fast running stream and that's the data you get. So you're happy if you get 10 variables. And of course, there's so many other processes and many of them you mentioned, which we cannot measure, but people know they happen, but they kind of abstract away. And this is one of the reasons why the predictability in this case is usually pretty bad because it just don't have the big drivers. But still, you could, in this context, you could still people still do recommendation for policy making based on this kind of models. And for that, it's much safer to say, I believe the causality goes in one direction, even if it's simplified, than saying, yeah, there's all correlation, but whatever, we anyway believe it.
The only thing I have to say is these people should have died.
Let's say this to the plan. Yes, we have some.
Maybe I can also respond as an ecologist. The topic I have to file a complaint because that number of ecology lobbying, and all these plant images don't have the any of those plants can be they have very
okay, but this was more to establish the beauty. Okay.
It can be formalized, but it can't be formulated as an equation. And I would say, as an ecologist, it's a physicist that forced this dynamic system thinking upon us. It's not us to make the best choice of model. And my question would be, isn't that the reason why the Well, this doom calculus is so difficult to transport into physical language because, as far as I'm encouraged as a computer scientist, it's very easy for him to say who this is a way of the physics. Well, maybe sometime ago when you work, you got a theory. So you work in the computer.
I don't
But the point is, you can easily say doom X and very difficult to say.
That's, I think, is one of the limitations. That's why the whole dynamics and feedback loop. But I think a lot of this comes from epidemiology, where basically people survey people, you survey people and say, if you drink a glass of red wine, you seem to live longer. And then they start saying, yeah, but probably you just have more money. That means you actually do more sports and you have better education. And all this, I think this is really also kind of an important background of this kind of things. And I think for our, I'm not saying all of ecology, but this kind of species distribution models, I think it's a really good fit to enhance this. I'm honestly not even that sure if the species distribution models at all are very useful, but that's not me to decide.
But it was more of a response to the question. I'm a climate scientist who experiment to work in a causal inference path. I identify with some of your concerns about dynamical systems and I'm struggling with that myself right now. But at the same time, I want to say that it's super common in my experience with climate science in my field, despite the fact that we all know it's a dynamical system over time and the atmospheric relationships. That one will depend on the basis we still allow to just draw linear correlation and then say how we figured it out. And essentially what we're doing when we're doing almost any of those methods besides just defining a climate model and running it and then accepting the fact that it may not look actually like it is making the same assumptions that you would make here, but not stating them super explicitly, which I think Andreas also said in his talk. And so I personally would much prefer it if all climate scientists, when they're doing any kind of modeling that doesn't, and regardless of what they're doing, that they would state their assumptions quite as clearly like this. And then we would be able to actually argue about whether or not those assumptions are reasonable and what the consequences are of changing those assumptions. And it helps you recognize what assumptions you're making to make sure that your analysis is consistent with them, which I think is important. Also, I would love to mention that there's also a related thing called causal discovery, which is to figure out how to reverse engineer such a graph from the conditional dependence relationship and is still a work in progress in terms of how well it works on real data, but is something that you can read about, and this is
Maybe just to add one thing, it's probably also a bit unfair because if you do this, you might realize you cannot come up with a meaningful causal graph, and then you shouldn't make any statements that you would like to make. And that can be also pretty humbling if you say, okay, this way of modeling I plan to do, I can really not do because and then you probably, that's probably some of your critic.
I can tell the time is going to be really. It's also a lot of work that I kind of finally those graphs and try to explicitly incorporate dynamics as well to some degree. I think some of the words are still very legitimate because it is hard to deal with confusion. But as soon as you have some degree of stationarity, and some periods of time where you can doesn't change or doesn't change too much, you can still say certain things. So there is definitely work in this direction that tries to deal limitations and words that have. So it's not quite as simple as Andreas presented for the sake of.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas.
Okay, that's it.